The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Hawkins as his horse trudged along the dusty trail leading into Redemption Bend. Sam had been riding for 3 weeks straight, searching for work, for purpose, for anything that might fill the hollow ache in his chest. At 42 years old, he had spent 2 decades drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. The lines on his weathered face told stories of loneliness and choices he wished he could take back. As he crested the final hill, something caught his eye. There, standing alone against the amber sky, was a small wooden chapel. Its white paint had long since peeled away, revealing grey, sun-bleached timber. The cross atop the steeple tilted at an angle, and several windows were broken, their jagged edges catching the late afternoon light. Yet despite its abandonment, something about the structure called to him. Sam guided his horse closer, dismounting near the weathered front steps. The door hung crooked on its hinges, groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of golden sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Rows of wooden pews sat covered in years of accumulated grit and debris. But what struck Sam most was the altar at the far end. Beneath layers of dust, he could make out intricate carvings in the wood, work done by skilled hands with love and devotion. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the empty space. As he stood before the altar, running his calloused fingers over the carvings, a strange feeling washed over him. For the first time in years, Sam felt something other than emptiness. He felt called to do something meaningful. In town, Sam learned the chapel had been abandoned 15 years ago when the previous preacher left, and no replacement ever came. The townspeople of Redemption Bend had simply moved on, building a newer church closer to the main street. Nobody had thought about the old chapel in years. That evening, as Sam sat in the small boarding house room he had rented, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would restore that chapel. He would give it new life and perhaps in doing so, find some redemption of his own. But Sam had no idea that beneath the very altar that had called to him lay secrets that would unravel everything he thought he knew about second chances. The next morning, Sam purchased basic carpentry tools, nails, and what lumber he could afford with his remaining savings. The owner of the general store, a kind woman named Martha Green, raised an eyebrow when he explained his plan. She told him most folks thought he was foolish to waste time on a building nobody wanted anymore, but she admired his determination. She even offered to donate some spare paint she had in her storage room. Sam worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. He started with the roof, replacing rotted shingles and securing loose beams. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way his ranch work never had. Each nail he drove, each board he replaced, felt like he was building something permanent for the first time in his life. The townspeople began to notice. At first they watched from a distance with curious skepticism. But gradually a few started to help. Old Timothy Marsh, a retired carpenter with hands twisted by arthritis, came by to offer advice. Young Billy Patterson brought water on hot afternoons. Even Martha Green brought meals when she noticed Sam was too absorbed in his work to eat properly. By the 3rd week, Sam had moved inside. He repaired the pews, replaced broken windows with glass donated by the town's glazier, and carefully cleaned the beautiful altar carvings. It was during this cleaning that he noticed something odd. One section of the floor directly in front of the altar seemed different from the rest. The boards were slightly newer, and when he knelt down to examine them closer, he realized they had been deliberately designed to be removed. His heart began to pound as he carefully pried up the boards. Beneath them was a hollow space, and inside that space was a metal box, locked with a simple latch that had rusted over the years. Sam's hands trembled as he lifted the box out and set it on the altar. The metal was cold and heavy. Whatever was inside had been hidden intentionally, placed there by someone who wanted it kept secret. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the chapel floor, Sam broke the rusted latch and slowly opened the lid. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small leather journal, and a single photograph of a young couple standing in front of this very chapel. The woman in the photograph had kind eyes and a gentle smile. The man stood proud beside her, his hand on her shoulder. But it was what Sam read in the first letter that made him sink onto the nearest pew in shock. Sam spent the entire night reading by lamplight. The letters and journal belonged to Reverend Thomas Whitmore, the preacher who had left 15 years ago. But the story they told was nothing like what the town remembered. Thomas Whitmore had not simply abandoned his flock. According to his journal entries, written in increasingly desperate handwriting, the Reverend had been struggling with a terrible burden. His wife, Elizabeth, had fallen gravely ill with consumption. The town doctor had done everything he could, but medicine was scarce and expensive in those frontier days. Thomas had spent every cent he had trying to save her, even selling his own possessions, but it was not enough. The journal revealed that Thomas had been offered a position at a larger church in Austin, one that came with a salary 3 times what he made in Redemption Bend. The new position would have provided the means to get Elizabeth the medical care she desperately needed. But accepting meant leaving his congregation, people who depended on him, and had no other spiritual guidance for miles around. The letters were correspondence between Thomas and Elizabeth. During the agonizing weeks he spent wrestling with this decision. Elizabeth's words were filled with love and selflessness. She begged him to stay with his congregation, insisting that his calling to serve the people of Redemption Bend was more important than her life. Thomas's responses showed a man being torn apart, caught between his devotion to his wife and his duty to his faith. In the end, according to the final journal entry, Thomas had made his choice. He stayed in Redemption Bend, turning down the position in Austin. But 3 months later, Elizabeth passed away. Consumed by guilt and grief, believing he had chosen wrong and that his decision had taken his wife from him, Thomas buried these letters and his journal beneath the altar. Then he left town in the middle of the night, unable to face the place where he had lost everything. As Sam read the last page, tears streamed down his face. He understood Thomas Whitmore's pain in a way he had not expected. Sam's own past was marked by similar regrets, by a family he had left behind years ago because he thought he was not good enough for them, by a wife who had begged him to stay, but whom he had abandoned out of shame over his failures. He had spent 20 years running, just as Thomas had run. The next morning, Sam did something he had not done in decades. He bowed his head in the restored chapel and prayed, not for answers, but for the courage to do what he now knew he must do. He had to find out what happened to Thomas Whitmore, and he had to make things right. Sam began his search by talking to the oldest residents of Redemption Bend. Martha Green remembered Elizabeth Whitmore as the kindest woman she had ever known, always helping families in need despite her own struggles. Old Timothy Marsh recalled Reverend Thomas as a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, but never complained. Through patient conversations and careful inquiry, Sam discovered that Thomas Whitmore had not disappeared entirely. After leaving Redemption Bend, he had wandered for several years before settling in a small settlement near the Rio Grande, where he worked as a school teacher. He never preached again. Some travelers who passed through reported seeing an older man matching his description, living quietly and simply, teaching children to read and write. Sam knew what he had to do. He organized a town meeting in the newly restored chapel, its walls now gleaming with fresh white paint, its windows sparkling in the sunlight, its pews polished and strong. When the townspeople gathered, curious about what the drifter cowboy who had restored their forgotten chapel could possibly have to say, Sam told them Thomas Whitmore's story. He read passages from the journal and letters, his voice breaking as he described the impossible choice the Reverend had faced and the love that had guided his decision. He explained how Thomas had stayed for them, sacrificing his own happiness and carrying guilt that was never his to bear. The chapel fell silent as the truth settled over them. Many wiped tears from their eyes. They had judged Thomas Whitmore as a man who had abandoned them, never knowing he had actually chosen them over everything else he held dear. Martha Green was the first to speak, her voice firm with determination. They needed to find Thomas Whitmore and bring him home, to let him know he had made the right choice, that Elizabeth's wisdom had been true, and that he was still loved and remembered. Over the following weeks, the town came together in a way they had not in years. They pooled resources to send word along the trade routes and frontier settlements. Sam volunteered to make the journey himself if necessary. Then, on a warm Sunday morning, 2 months after Sam had first discovered the hidden box, a wagon appeared on the road leading into Redemption Bend. Driving it was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and the same kind eyes from the photograph. Thomas Whitmore had come home. The entire town gathered at the restored chapel, As Thomas stepped inside, seeing his life's work brought back to beauty by the hands of a stranger and the hearts of his old congregation, he finally allowed himself to weep. Sam approached him and quietly placed the metal box in his hands. Thomas opened it, touching the letters and journal as if they were sacred relics. Then he looked up at Sam with understanding in his eyes. These two men, both running from their pasts, both believing themselves unworthy of love and forgiveness, had found each other through an abandoned chapel and a hidden truth. Thomas stayed in Redemption Bend, not as a preacher, but as a beloved elder who shared his wisdom freely. And Sam, the lone cowboy who had drifted for 20 years, finally found the courage to write a letter of his own, one addressed to the family he had left behind, asking if perhaps it was not too late for his own redemption. The old chapel stood once again as a beacon on the hill, restored not just by carpentry and paint, but by truth, forgiveness, and the understanding that our deepest regrets can become our greatest teachers. Sometimes the things we find beneath the surface, the secrets buried in shame and sorrow, are exactly what we need to discover to finally come home. Sam sat at the small wooden desk in his boarding house room, a blank piece of paper before him, and a pen trembling in his weathered hand. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas Whitmore's return, and the old Reverend's story had awakened something in Sam that he could no longer ignore. For 20 years he had told himself that leaving his family had been the right choice, that Rebecca and little Sarah were better off without a failure like him. But now, seeing Thomas's pain and understanding the weight of choices made in fear rather than love, Sam knew he had been wrong. He began to write, his rough handwriting moving slowly across the page. He told Rebecca everything, how he had left because he felt ashamed of losing their small farm to debt, how he had convinced himself she deserved better than a man who could not provide. He wrote about the empty years of drifting, the loneliness that had become his only companion, and how restoring the chapel had somehow restored something inside himself. He asked not for forgiveness, but simply for a chance to know if she and Sarah were well, if they had found happiness without him. The next morning, Sam rode into town and handed the letter to the postal clerk, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The clerk told him that mail to Kansas, where Rebecca's family had lived, could take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, and a reply, if one came at all, might take just as long. Sam returned to the chapel, where he had taken on the role of caretaker. Thomas Whitmore often joined him there, and the two men would sit in comfortable silence, each understanding the other's journey without need for many words. One afternoon, as they repaired a loose board on the chapel steps, Thomas finally spoke about Elizabeth. He described how her love had been unconditional, how she had seen the best in him even when he could not see it himself. He admitted that for 15 years he had believed he had made the wrong choice by staying in Redemption Bend, that his decision had taken her life. But now, surrounded by the community that still remembered them both with love, he understood that Elizabeth had been right. Some choices are not about winning or losing, but about honoring what matters most. Sam listened, absorbing every word. He realized that his own fear of failure had blinded him to what Rebecca had tried to tell him all those years ago, that she had never wanted wealth or success, only him. The waiting became almost unbearable. Every day Sam would ride into town to check with the postal clerk, and every day he would return empty-handed. The townspeople watched his growing anxiety with sympathy. Martha Green assured him that patience was its own form of courage, that reaching out had been the hardest part, and now he simply had to trust. Then, on a crisp autumn morning exactly 2 months after he had sent his letter, the postal clerk handed Sam an envelope with his name written in elegant handwriting he had never forgotten. His hands shook so badly that Thomas had to help him open it. Inside were 3 pages filled with words that made Sam's eyes blur with tears. Rebecca had received his letter, and she had never stopped loving him. Sam read Rebecca's letter so many times that the pages became soft and worn at the edges. Her words painted a picture of the life she had lived after he left, and each sentence carried both pain and grace. She wrote that when he had disappeared that night 20 years ago, she had been devastated, not because of the lost farm, but because she had lost him. She described the months of searching, of asking travelers and ranch hands if they had seen a man matching his description, of holding their daughter Sarah and trying to explain why her father had gone away. But Rebecca's letter was not filled with anger or resentment. Instead, she wrote with the wisdom of someone who had learned to find peace despite heartbreak. She had moved back to her family's home in Kansas with 5-year-old Sarah, and her parents had helped her start a small seamstress business. Over the years, she had built a modest but stable life. Sarah had grown into a strong, intelligent young woman who now worked as a schoolteacher in the nearby town. Rebecca explained that she had never remarried, not because she was waiting for Sam, but because she had learned to find completeness within herself. Yet she confessed that not a year had gone by when she did not wonder where he was, if he was safe, if he ever thought of them. The most powerful part of her letter came near the end. Rebecca wrote that she had forgiven him long ago, understanding that sometimes people run not because they do not love, but because they do not believe they are worthy of being loved. She said that everyone deserves a second chance to make things right, and if Sam truly wanted to reconnect, she would welcome him back into her life, not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become. She included a separate letter from Sarah, shorter but equally moving. His daughter, now 25 years old, wrote that she had spent her childhood creating an image of her father from her mother's stories and her own imagination. She admitted feeling hurt and confused by his absence, but her mother had taught her that forgiveness was not about forgetting, but about choosing not to let past pain define the future. She wanted to meet him, to hear his story in his own words, to see if they could build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Sam brought both letters to Thomas at the chapel, his voice breaking as he read them aloud. The old reverend smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. He told Sam that grace had a way of finding us, even when we believed ourselves beyond its reach, that the very act of reaching out with honesty and humility had opened a door Sam had thought was locked forever. But Sam was terrified. What if he disappointed them again? What if 20 years apart had created a distance too vast to bridge? What if he was not the man Rebecca remembered, or the father Sarah deserved? Thomas placed a gentle hand on Sam's shoulder and reminded him of the lesson they had both learned. The chapel had been restored not in a single day, but board by board, nail by nail, through consistent effort and dedication. Relationships, like buildings, could be rebuilt the same way through patience, honesty, and the willingness to show up even when the work seemed impossible. Sam made his decision. He would go to Kansas, not with expectations of instant reconciliation, but with the humble hope of beginning again. He spent the next week preparing for the journey, and the townspeople of Redemption Bend rallied around him. Martha Green packed supplies for his travel. Timothy Marsh gave him a beautifully carved wooden box to present to Rebecca, a gift representing the craftsmanship and care Sam had learned through restoring the chapel. Even young Billy Patterson contributed a handful of wildflower seeds, suggesting Sam could plant them with his daughter as a symbol of new growth. On the morning of his departure, Thomas Whitmore met Sam at the chapel one final time. The old reverend had written his own letter, one addressed to Rebecca, explaining how Sam had discovered his story and how that discovery had led to both their redemptions. He sealed it and handed it to Sam, telling him that sometimes we need others to speak the truths about us that we cannot say ourselves. As Sam mounted his horse and prepared to ride toward Kansas, toward uncertainty and hope, he turned back to look at the restored chapel one last time. The morning sun caught its white walls and gleaming cross, and Sam understood that he was not the same broken man who had wandered into Redemption Bend months ago. He had been restored too, piece by piece, through hard work, truth, and the kindness of people who had shown him that redemption was always possible. The journey ahead would take weeks, but for the first time in 20 years, Sam was not running away from something. He was riding toward it. The Kansas landscape unfolded before Sam in rolling waves of golden prairie grass, so different from the harsh, dusty terrain of Texas. As he rode through small farming communities and past fields ready for harvest, Sam's anxiety grew with each passing mile. He had rehearsed 1,000 things to say, but every imagined conversation felt inadequate against the weight of 20 years. 3 weeks after leaving Redemption Bend, Sam arrived in Lawrence, Kansas, the town where Rebecca's family had lived. His heart hammered in his chest as he asked directions to the address she had written in her letter. The house was a modest, well-kept structure, with a small garden in front where late-season flowers still bloomed. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Rebecca's Fine Sewing and Alterations." Sam dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the fence post with hands that refused to stay steady. He stood there for several long minutes, gathering courage before finally walking up the front path and knocking gently on the door. The woman who opened it took his breath away. Rebecca was 43 now, her dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and fine lines framed her eyes. But those eyes, warm and intelligent, were exactly as he remembered them. For a moment neither spoke, 20 years collapsing into a single suspended breath. Then Rebecca's hand went to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She whispered his name like a question and a statement all at once. Sam found his voice rough with emotion, and said the words he had traveled so far to speak. He told her he was sorry, that he had been wrong, that running away had been the biggest mistake of his life. He did not ask for anything except the chance to try to make things right, however long that might take. Rebecca stepped forward and did something Sam had not dared to hope for. She embraced him, and in that embrace was not the passion of their youth but something deeper, the recognition of two people who had both survived loss and learned hard lessons about love and forgiveness. She invited him inside, and they sat in her small, cozy parlor talking for hours. Sam told her everything about his years of drifting, about finding the chapel, about Thomas Whitmore's story and how it had shown him the truth about his own choices. Rebecca listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to touch his hand as if reassuring herself that he was real. She shared her own journey, the struggles and small victories of building a life alone, the pride she felt in Sarah's accomplishments, the quiet contentment she had found in her work and community. As the afternoon light faded, Rebecca told him that Sarah would return soon from the school where she taught. Sam's nervousness returned in full force. Meeting his daughter after 20 years felt even more daunting than facing Rebecca. What could he possibly say to a child he had abandoned, who was now a woman he did not know? When the door opened and Sarah walked in, Sam stood immediately, his heart in his throat. She was beautiful, with her mother's intelligent eyes and a strong, confident bearing. She stopped when she saw him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of absence and unanswered questions. Then Sarah spoke, her voice steady but cautious, asking if he was her father. Sam could only nod, unable to find words. Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Sam saw the little girl he had left behind in her face, mixed with the independent woman she had become. She told him honestly that she did not know what to feel, that anger and curiosity and hope were all tangled together inside her. But she was willing to listen, to hear his story and decide for herself if they could find a way forward. They sat together, all three of them, as darkness fell outside and Rebecca lit lamps throughout the room. Sam told his story again, this time for his daughter, holding nothing back about his shame, his fear, his years of regret. He did not make excuses or ask for pity, only understanding. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed both her intelligence and her pain. When Sam finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she told him something that struck him deeply. She said that her mother had taught her that people were more than their worst mistakes, that growth and change were always possible if someone had the courage to try. She could not promise immediate forgiveness or that they would instantly become a family, but she was willing to give him the chance to prove through actions, not just words, that he had truly changed. Sam stayed in Lawrence, renting a small room above the general store. He did not rush or push for more than Rebecca and Sarah were ready to give. Instead, he showed up day after day, in small and consistent ways. He repaired Rebecca's front steps, which had been wobbling for months. He built new shelves for her sewing room. He attended the Sunday services at the local church, sitting in the back row, slowly becoming a familiar face in the community. With Sarah, the process was slower and more delicate. She agreed to meet him once a week for supper at her mother's house, and during those careful evenings, they began the tentative work of knowing each other. Sam asked about her childhood, her education, her work as a teacher. Sarah asked about his years drifting, his skills with horses and carpentry, his experience restoring the chapel. Gradually, through these conversations, they started building a foundation of understanding. One Saturday, Sarah invited Sam to help her at the schoolhouse, where several desks needed repair before winter arrived. As they worked side by side, sanding wood and tightening joints, Sarah opened up about her feelings. She admitted that growing up without a father had been hard, that she had felt abandoned and confused, but she also acknowledged that holding on to anger had not served her well, and that seeing him genuinely try to make amends meant more than she had expected. Sam listened, accepting her truth without defensiveness, and when he spoke, he told her something he had learned from Thomas Whitmore. He said that we cannot change the past, but we can choose what we build with the time we have left, and that every day he spent with her and her mother was a gift he had not earned, but would treasure nonetheless. As autumn turned toward winter, something remarkable happened. The rigid boundaries between past and present began to soften. Rebecca and Sam took walks together through the town, talking about everything and nothing, rediscovering the connection they had once shared while acknowledging they were different people now. Sarah began to smile more easily in Sam's presence, and once, when he successfully fixed a complicated problem with the schoolhouse's heating stove, she impulsively hugged him, a brief embrace that meant everything. The people of Lawrence gradually accepted Sam as well. They saw a man who showed up to community workdays, who was respectful and humble, who clearly loved the two women he was trying so hard to reconnect with. Martha Green would have been proud of how the community embraced him, just as Redemption Bend had embraced both Sam and Thomas. On Christmas Eve, Rebecca invited Sam to join them for dinner, the first holiday they had shared in 20 years. As they sat around the table, Sarah offered a toast. She said that family was not just about blood or history, but about choosing to show up and do the hard work of loving each other despite imperfections. She looked at Sam and told him that while he would never get back the years he had missed, he could be part of the years to come if he continued to prove himself worthy of that trust. Sam's eyes filled with tears as he thanked them both, his voice breaking with emotion. He promised to spend the rest of his life being the man they deserved, not perfect but present, not without flaws but willing to keep trying. After dinner, Sam gave Rebecca the carved wooden box Timothy Marsh had made, and she opened it to find it filled with letters Sam had written during his time in Texas, documenting his journey of change. He gave Sarah the wildflower seeds Billy Patterson had contributed, explaining their symbolic meaning. Together they planned to plant them in the spring, creating something beautiful from small beginnings. As the evening ended and Sam prepared to return to his room, Rebecca walked him to the door. Under the soft glow of the porch lamp, she told him something that took his breath away. She said that she could see the man he had become, that his actions over these months had shown her genuine transformation. While they could not simply erase 20 years, they could write a new story together, one built on honesty, patience, and the understanding that love sometimes means giving people room to grow into who they are meant to be. Sam returned to his room that night with a heart fuller than he could remember. He wrote a letter to Thomas Whitmore, telling him about his homecoming, about the slow but steady rebuilding of his family, about the hope that had replaced the emptiness he had carried for so long. He thanked Thomas for sharing his story, for showing him that redemption was not a single moment but a daily choice. Spring came to Kansas with an explosion of green. Sam, Rebecca, and Sarah planted the wildflower seeds together in Rebecca's garden, working the soil side by side. As they covered the seeds and watered them gently, Sam realized that this was what restoration truly meant, not erasing what had been broken but carefully, patiently building something new from the pieces that remained. The lone cowboy who had once drifted without purpose had finally found his way home, not to the past but to a future he would build one day at a time through love, work, and the understanding that beneath the surface of our deepest regrets lie the seeds of our greatest transformations. Chapter 9. The Chapel's Promise. 2 years had passed since Sam's arrival in Kansas, and the wildflowers in Rebecca's garden had grown thick and vibrant, returning each spring more abundant than the last. Sam had become a permanent fixture in Lawrence, no longer the outsider seeking redemption, but a trusted member of the community. He had opened a small carpentry shop on Main Street, where his skilled hands created furniture, repaired wagon wheels, and fixed anything the townspeople brought to him. His reputation for honest work and fair prices had spread throughout the county. Rebecca's seamstress business had flourished as well, and she had expanded to include 2 apprentices, young women from the area whom she trained with the same patience and care she showed in everything. On quiet evenings, Sam and Rebecca would sit on her front porch, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and amber, talking about their days with the comfortable ease of two people who had learned to trust each other again. Sarah had become more than just accepting of her father's presence. She had grown to genuinely enjoy their time together. Every Sunday after church, they would have lunch at Rebecca's house, and Sam would tell stories about his restoration of the chapel in Texas, about Thomas Whitmore, and about the lessons he had learned. Sarah, in turn, shared her experiences teaching, her dreams of perhaps opening a school for children whose families could not afford traditional education, her hopes for the future. One spring morning, a letter arrived from Redemption Bend. It was from Thomas Whitmore, and as Sam opened it, his hands trembled with anticipation. The old reverend wrote with his characteristic gentle wisdom, sharing news of the town. The chapel had become the heart of the community once again, hosting not just services, but gatherings, celebrations, and meetings. Martha Green had organized a women's group that met there weekly. Young Billy Patterson had grown into a responsible young man and had taken over maintaining the building's upkeep. But the most significant news came in the letter's final paragraphs. Thomas wrote that the town council had officially renamed the building the Chapel of Second Chances, and they were planning a dedication ceremony in 2 months. Thomas asked if Sam would consider returning for the event, and more importantly, if he would bring his family. The town wanted to meet the people who had inspired Sam's transformation, the ones who had given him the courage to seek redemption. Sam brought the letter to Rebecca and Sarah that evening, reading it aloud as they sat in the parlor. When he finished, he looked at them both with uncertainty. He told them he would only go if they wanted to, that he would not ask them to travel so far, or to revisit the place where his journey had begun without their full consent. Rebecca reached across and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. She said that she had always wondered about the chapel Sam had described in such detail, about the town that had shown him kindness when he needed it most, about the man whose story had changed everything. She wanted to see it, to meet the people who had been part of Sam's transformation. Sarah nodded in agreement, adding that she was curious about this place that had meant so much to her father's journey, and that perhaps seeing it would help her understand even more deeply the path he had walked to find his way back to them. The decision was made. They would travel to Texas together, the three of them as a family. Over the following weeks, Sam prepared for the journey with careful attention to detail. He closed his carpentry shop temporarily, arranging for a neighbor to watch over it. Rebecca organized her business so her apprentices could manage during her absence. Sarah made arrangements with the school board for a temporary replacement teacher. The journey south took them through Missouri and into Oklahoma Territory before finally crossing into Texas. Sam pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories of his years of drifting, no longer with shame but with honest reflection. Rebecca and Sarah listened, asking questions, learning more about the man Sam had been and appreciating even more the man he had become. When they finally crested the hill overlooking Redemption Bend, Sam's breath caught in his throat. The town had grown since he had left. New buildings lined the main street, and the sound of activity carried on the warm Texas breeze. But there, standing proud against the blue sky, was the chapel, its white walls gleaming in the sunlight, its cross standing straight and true. As their wagon rolled into town, people began to recognize Sam. They emerged from shops and homes, calling out greetings, their faces lit with genuine joy. Martha Green was the first to reach them, embracing Sam with the affection of a dear friend. Timothy Marsh moved slowly but surely to shake Sam's hand, his arthritis-gnarled fingers gripping firmly. Billy Patterson, now a strapping young man of 20, grinned widely as he helped Rebecca and Sarah down from the wagon. Thomas Whitmore stood waiting at the chapel entrance, his silver hair catching the light. When Sam introduced him to Rebecca and Sarah, the old reverend's eyes filled with tears. He took Rebecca's hands in his and told her that her letters, which Sam had shared with him, had shown him the power of forgiveness and grace. He thanked Sarah for giving her father the chance to prove that people could change, that second chances were not just words but living possibilities. That evening, the town held a welcoming dinner in the chapel's courtyard, where tables had been set up and lanterns hung from the trees. The community gathered to share food, stories, and laughter. Rebecca sat beside Martha Green, the two women quickly forming a connection as they discussed their businesses and their experiences of resilience. Sarah spoke with the local schoolteacher, exchanging ideas about education and sharing her dreams of opening a school for underprivileged children. Sam stood with Thomas, both men quiet for a moment as they watched the scene before them. Thomas finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. He said that the chapel had indeed become a place of second chances, but not just for the two of them. It had become a symbol for the entire community, a reminder that broken things could be restored, that abandoned dreams could be rekindled, and that it was never too late to choose love over fear. The dedication ceremony took place 2 days later, on a perfect Sunday morning. The entire town gathered, filling the chapel and spilling out into the courtyard. The mayor gave a speech about the building's history and its transformation. Martha Green spoke about how Sam's dedication had inspired the community to care for what they had once forgotten. Then Thomas invited Sam to say a few words. Sam stood before the congregation, Rebecca and Sarah seated in the front pew, their presence giving him strength. He spoke simply and from the heart. He thanked the town for accepting a broken, drifting cowboy and giving him purpose. He talked about what he had found beneath the altar, not just the physical box of letters, but the deeper truth that our mistakes do not define us unless we let them. He acknowledged Thomas Whitmore's courage in returning home and thanked him for showing that redemption required both seeking forgiveness and forgiving ourselves. Then Sam did something unexpected. He invited Rebecca and Sarah to stand beside him. With his voice thick with emotion, he told the congregation about his own journey home, about the family he had abandoned and the long road back to them. He explained how the chapel had taught him that restoration was possible, and that lesson had given him the courage to seek restoration in his own life. Rebecca spoke then, her voice clear and strong. She told the gathered people that forgiveness was not weakness, but the bravest choice we can make, that it required seeing people not just for who they were, but for who they could become. She thanked them for caring for Sam when he needed it most, for helping him become the man standing beside her now. Sarah added her own words, saying that she had learned from both her parents that families could be rebuilt, that trust could be earned back through consistent actions, and that love was not just a feeling, but a daily decision to show up and try. As the ceremony concluded, the congregation sang together, their voices rising in harmony and filling the chapel with sound. Sam stood between Rebecca and Sarah, Thomas on his other side, and felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. After the service, as people mingled and celebrated, Billy Patterson approached Sam with something in his hands. It was a hand-carved wooden sign, beautifully crafted, with words burned into the polished surface. It read, "The Chapel of Second Chances. Founded 1868, restored 1883. May all who enter find hope, healing, and the courage to begin again." Billy explained that he had made it himself, using the skills he had learned watching Sam work. He asked if Sam would help him hang it above the chapel entrance. Together, Sam, Billy, Thomas, Rebecca, and Sarah carried the sign to the front of the building. As they secured it in place, Sam stepped back and looked at what they had created together. The chapel stood as more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of second chances, to the possibility of restoration, to the truth that beneath our deepest regrets often lie our greatest opportunities for transformation. That evening, as Sam and his family prepared to begin their journey back to Kansas, Thomas gave Sam one final gift. It was a small wooden cross, carved from a piece of the original chapel altar, the same altar beneath which the hidden box had rested. Thomas told him to keep it as a reminder that what we find beneath the surface when we have the courage to look can change everything. Sam held the cross in his calloused hands, feeling its smooth surface and the love with which it had been crafted. He promised Thomas he would return to visit, that Redemption Bend would always be part of his story. As their wagon pulled away the next morning, Sam looked back one last time at the chapel on the hill. The morning sun illuminated its white walls and the new sign above its entrance. Rebecca squeezed his hand. Sarah smiled at him from the back of the wagon, and Sam understood that he was no longer a lone cowboy seeking redemption. He was a man who had found it, who had been restored not just by his own efforts, but by the grace of others, by forgiveness freely given, and by the understanding that it is never too late to come home. The road ahead stretched out before them, leading back to Kansas, to their life together, to the future they would continue building day by day. And in Sam's pocket, The small wooden cross rested close to his heart, a permanent reminder of what he had learned, that beneath every broken altar, every abandoned dream, every regretful choice, lies the possibility of transformation, waiting patiently for us to find the courage to look.